Hello, college football fans. Welcome to episode 199 of College Football Throwdown. I'm your co-host, Alex Schmitz, and today I'm joined, as always, by my dad, Peter Schmitz.
Hello, college football fans and Husker fans.
That's right.
Good to be back on the podcast, Alex.
Yes, one away from 200. Can you believe it?
No, I can't. That's pretty amazing. Every time we start talking about it, it's pretty amazing.
Yes, we're almost at our 10-year anniversary of doing the podcast as well.
I know. Yeah, and that's the thing. It's not like we're a podcast where we're doing it every day or even every week. We do it every week during the season, but then, about monthly the rest of the year each year. So it's taken a while to get to 200, but it represents a substantial period of time and commitment to the sport and to Nebraska football.
Yeah, I guess thinking on that, if we were doing it like as a weekly podcast, we'd be closer to 500 right now, but that's a lot more commitment than I'm ready for, I think. Yeah,
exactly.
All right. Well, if this is your first time listening to our podcast, we have 198 other ones for you to listen to. And we're a father-son duo here to talk about college football by college football fans for college football fans. And today we'll be discussing some updates in the world of Husker sports, but primarily we'll be focused on some big national pieces of discussion since we last did our podcast in April. Obviously, we've had the updates to the college football playoff for this year in terms of the seeding. And just recently, the House settlement was officially handed down from the courts. And so that's a big shift in the world of college sports that we would like to discuss as we record here on June 9th. So yeah, a lot to get to on this particular episode, as always. But before we dive into everything, we're going to stick with our tradition and open up a cold beverage. I got myself one of my Golden Road Mango Carts once again.
Well, and I'm going pretty low key here with a Miller Lite tonight.
Ooh.
Now that I'm back east here, Alex, we're now in that 3-hour separation, so it's 7 o'clock for you, 7:15, and I'm 10:15.
There you go.
Cheers.
We have to see if you can last to the end of this podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
So one fun thing we just wanted to start off this podcast with is to go back to our previous episode 198, where we had a discussion/debate about overtime, specifically the collegiate overtime versus the NFL's overtime rules. And you were on the NFL side and I was more on the college side. And I did some more research on it afterwards. And what neither of us knew at the time that we recorded, which was in pretty early April, was that just recently the NFL had voted and made a change to their overtime rules, which is that even in the regular season, if the team that gets the possession of the ball first in the beginning of overtime scores a touchdown, the other team gets a possession to try to score back and tie the game and keep it going. Whereas the old rule was that during the regular season, at least, if the team that got the ball first scored a touchdown, it was just game over. But that rule was controversial amongst many people. First, they abolished it in the playoffs, and now just recently here they've abolished it in the regular season. So I will say to your defense, because you were making the point that the NFL rules are better because it's more like normal football. There's still a kickoff rather than starting from the 25-yard line like you do in college. I am more open now to the idea of the NFL rules now that they've made this change, because the thing I hated the most was that the coin flip could decide so much. And I looked up and there are statistics showing that the team that won that coin toss won 15% more of the time. Like it was a distinct advantage in the NFL to be the team that won the coin toss that went first because of that rule, which I don't think is fair.
Well, and okay, so and I'm in agreement with you there, but maybe it's because of the history, that of the experience that I had, because prior to that rule that just got amended for many years, when overtime was just getting started in the NFL, even a field goal on the first drive led to immediate victory. And so that's where the coin flip was massively important, because all the team had to do after the kickoff was, basically get about 4 first downs and get to about the 30-yard line or whatever, and with NFL kickers, maybe the 28, you'd kick it and be done with it. The game's over.
Right.
And that's the way it was for a number of years. And then they finally switched it to the one that they had where the only way you could win it on that first drive is if you actually went in and scored a full touchdown, right? Then it would matter. And now they've gone a step further and said, no, we're just going to get rid of that being able to win on the first drive, and in an overtime situation, we're going to always give both teams a chance.
Right. To be specific, from 1974 to 2010, that was the rule. It was sudden death. So for quite a long time, which I'm amazed it survived that long, personally. The other thing I thought was interesting was I kind of looked around at like, what do college fans think, because obviously we're still only a few years into this new system in college where after 2 normal college overtimes, if the game is still tied, we go to this, 2-point conversion where there's only one play by both teams. You're just going back and forth with that until someone wins. And from what I saw, that is generally unpopular amongst the college football fan base. They don't like the current system, so they agree with you there, but they want to go back to the previous college system of starting at 25 and just going back and forth with that. They don't like the NFL system, even with the new changes to it.
And you got this out of some quick survey or something that was done?
I was looking at, there were online forums, so they're the more hardcore college football fans. It was not comprehensive in any sort of way. I don't want to portray that like it was, but the general sentiment was definitely the previous college rules are the best overtime. We should stick with that.
Just another example that I'm the curmudgeon then. I'm just older than most college football fans at this point, probably.
Right. But I did see one person's one comment I saw online I thought was actually rather interesting, and a adapted version of the original college football rules to maybe make them more definitive, let's say, to avoid ties as much and them going into multiple overtimes. So this person said, start at the 25-yard line, touchdowns and 2-point conversions only. So no field goals, and if you score a touchdown, you have to go for 2. If both teams score and they tie, then basically you move the ball back. So move it back from the 25 to the 30 or to the 35. And you basically keep repeating that, moving further and further back until one team doesn't score.
Well, all of those are I get the logic of why they do it. It's just, this idea of setting the ball at a certain spot. Why not just kick it off and start it at the 25 like a normal kickoff rules would require? That's my argument.
Right. And then, of course, it gets back to, what's your main goal, right? Is it to make a good product for the fans? Is it to protect player safety? Is it to shorten the length of overtime, for TV and commercial reasons? What your main focus is really determines what the best rule is.
That you're exactly right. And so why some of these various scenarios have, been considered and even implemented were almost always driven by things other than, the purity of the sport of football, and far more about getting the thing resolved in a timely fashion so that the number of snaps and the risk of injury is diminished. So those are the overriding goals of it. And it's less so about continuing to play the sport of football so we can determine who the best football team is. Right. And so that's the deal.
And last thing I'll mention, because you brought this up as well, that in the NFL, currently it's a 10-minute overtime. It used to be 15. They shortened it to 10. And in the regular season, if you get to that end of that 10 minutes of overtime and the game is still tied, it just goes down as a tie. But in the playoffs, obviously it's a tournament format, so you have to keep playing. So basically, they just start a new overtime of 10 minutes, and they keep going until somebody wins. Now, I know you brought up player safety previously on our college football discussion, talking about how you don't love the college system because, one of the benefits of the NFL is it leads to shorter overtime periods. But personally, I hate the idea of ties in college, especially when we have our playoff committee deciding who makes it into the playoff, and we already have enough consternation over some of their reasoning. Imagine if, we're looking at who gets those last 2 or 3 playoff spots and you're dealing with teams that have ties on their record as well as wins and losses. So I personally think if we did go with an NFL type system, I would go with the playoff style, where if you reach the end of the 10-minute period and it's still tied, you just play again.
Well, and so like you said, there's a lot of varying goals whenever you put something like that together, and so it's a compromise. I would agree with the general fan assumption that you made, that the current college system is not well liked, and I think leads to potentially more injury situations, because then you get the guys going for a long time, because all of a sudden everybody's exhausted defensively, and it's virtually impossible to keep people out on the 2.5 yard, 2-point conversion type situation. So after and with the delays, it's mind boggling. So yeah, I don't like that at all.
Agreed. We could shake on that one.
There you go.
All right. And then another piece of news that happened after we wrapped our previous podcast was that Nebraska got a pretty big commit for our 2027 class, which is a 4-star quarterback named Trey Taylor. So he may be the future of our program down the line.
Right. It would appear that he is a young man who's got a level of maturity from the interviews that I've been able to see that puts him ahead of the curve for sure. And he has made a conscious decision to make this commitment when he did, so he could do, an extensive amount of peer recruiting. And he's already making good on that commitment that he's made to help support Nebraska football. And it also appears that Coach Rule is also kind of guiding a decision within our organization, maybe a recognition that the 2026 recruiting class is going to be rather small, because we don't have a ton of seniors leaving, and we still have to downsize, even with the thing we're going to talk about next with the House rules established. There's a grandfathering aspect that maybe softens this a little bit. I don't know, but bottom line is they were working with that in mind in how they structured all of this stuff, and that's one of those unintended consequences. But the bottom line is, I think we were planning to have a relatively small 2026 freshman class anyway, and this Trey Taylor is a great foundational piece for the 2027 year, where we're going to need a lot more players, right? Because we have a lot more guys who will be leaving the program, running out of eligibility at that point.
Yep, it's definitely a nice sign for the future there. And then another cool thing is to highlight Nebraska baseball, which is not a team we talk about pretty much at all on this podcast. But they did win the Big Ten tournament in baseball since we last did a podcast. So we always want to highlight a Nebraska championship if one of our teams gets one.
Yeah, and the thing is it was a team that really had high hopes going into the season. We are actually we're back-to-back champions, right? We won it 2 years in a row. Going into the season, we were very optimistic about this year, but then like literally in the first week of the season, we lost one of our top 3 pitchers. In baseball, it's usually a 3-game series, so you'd like to have 3 really good pitchers, so that each of those 3 games that you play in a series against another team, that you have a greater chance of winning at least 2 of those 3 games, and maybe sometimes all 3, right? That's what good teams do. And Nebraska got put behind the 8 ball right away, because one of their best pitchers, if not their best pitcher, was sidelined for the year, and probably for the career. I don't know what the status of it is, but I believe it was a knee injury, which for a pitcher can be devastating. And that kind of put us behind the 8 ball, right? And we really were up and down all year, and never quite figured out how to get our pitching rotation down until late in the season. And then we finally started getting it going. But it was too late. We had already lost too many conference games and stuff. And so, the expectation had been diminished, let's just say. and then we turned around and put it together really well because we were actually quite dominant in the Big Ten conference baseball tournament. Now that did get us then the automatic bid, and we played in the NCAA tournament in baseball. We didn't come out of that regional. North Carolina did, but it was a heck of an accomplishment given how the year played out early.
Right. Yeah. Nice comeback story there.
Yeah.
And then we've been making some jokes on the past podcast about these college football playoff meetings coming and then going with nothing really happening, nothing really changing. But since we last did a podcast, they actually did do something, and something we were advocating for, which is that they made a change for this upcoming 2025 season, that this year's playoff, the top 4 teams will be based off of their overall seeding by the playoff committee rather than the 4 major conferences champions automatically qualifying in those top 4 spots. I think that was the flaw in the previous system that everybody talked about last year. And good to see that being addressed, that they were able to get the ACC and the Big 12 to come to terms with that, because obviously it affects them more negatively than anyone else.
Potentially, yes, that's right. Still, the season still has to play out to really figure out if that has a negative impact. But certainly, that was the right decision given what we have right now, and knowing that it's going to change then for the following season.
Yep. So that was a good thing to see. And now it's time to get into the meat of this episode, which will be about the House settlement. As you mentioned, we did discuss it a bit on our podcast in April. At the time, the main news was about the judge advocating for changes to the roster limit system, that the current players be grandfathered in so they don't have to be forced out of the system, and the 105 roster limit wouldn't take effect until, I guess, the next school year, and the kids being brought into this new system as it currently exists. And basically, after we did that podcast, the NCAA and the conferences made that change. So now the current players are grandfathered in, so they don't have to leave. So that 105 roster cap won't set in for a while. So I think it'll be kind of like what we had with these COVID years, right? Where these players who had these extended years because of COVID have kind of lasted now into this post-COVID era. So we may have something similar where we have these players on the team that stay on and are above the 105 limit because they're grandfathered in, but eventually that will pass away and the new rule will kind of stick in place.
Right. So there'll be basically a transition, and each school is going to have some ability to control how that happens in terms of how many of those people they choose to extend into the grandfather clause. Now, something that is interesting about the grandfather thing is that it does include for the remainder of that person's eligibility clock. So that if that person who was part of that grandfathered group then wanted to transfer next year and still had eligibility left, then that grandfathering does remain alive for that athlete and can be utilized at another institution. So it stays with the athlete if they transfer.
Right. But then the meat of the settlement is what we'll be talking about today. And so I'm going to start off with just a kind of recap of the main points of it, and feel free to correct me if I get something wrong here. But I think I've done my research. So the big thing is that the NCAA will be paying $2.8 billion in back damages for the next 10 years to athletes from 2016 to now who were, damaged by this lack of, being able to be properly compensated. That's part of the settlement. And in terms of what's happening moving forward, every team will now be able to pay their athletes directly from the school. Up to this point, it's been all NIL and collectives and things like that, but now it'll actually be the schools paying the athletes. There's a $20.5 million cap for every FBS school who wants to do that. And apparently that number was achieved by going with a 22% average of annual revenue that FBS schools get from ticket sales, broadcast rights, etc. So obviously that number is much higher for, the teams on the top end, much lower for the teams on the bottom end. So I guess this is the average number that was settled upon.
Right.
Also, the NCAA, as we know it, is essentially dead. It still exists to organize tournaments, such as like the NCAA basketball tournament. Those things will still exist. But in terms of actually enforcing these new rules, there's a brand new third-party commission that has been made. It's called the College Sports Commission. And it basically will organize and enforce the new rules about the overall revenue sharing and NIL. Specifically, there is a new system called NIL Go, which is an electronic system that athletes will be required to use to report the details of their NIL deals with entities other than their schools. So essentially, then this organization, the College Sports Commission, will determine the legitimacy of those deals and the specific language. Athletes can seek arbitration if they want to challenge a determination that a deal is not legitimate relative to having a, quote, valid business purpose and being within a, quote, reasonable range of compensation, unquote. So that, of course, is where a lot of the discussion has come, because that's where the rubbers really hit the road. Because if all the schools now get $20.5 million to share with their athletes, okay, first the schools have to figure out how much of that are they allocating to the various sports, and everyone basically agrees that college football is going to get the vast majority of that because it is the main money generator for these athletic institutions. But then the differentiator will be, okay, what can you get me in NIL? That'll be what differentiates what you get in Nebraska versus what you get at Alabama or what have you.
Right.
And the idea is that this College Sports Commission will enforce these new rules to be more strict. And I saw a post saying Deloitte officials reportedly shared that 70% of past deals from NIL collectives would have been denied under the new rules, while 90% of past deals from public companies would have been approved. So these new rules are supposed to be stricter about, some of the chicanery that we know that's been going on with these NIL collectives and these players being paid to do things, that involve very little, work on the player's part. It's not like they're being the sponsor for a local car company or something. They're getting $1 million for, showing up at an event,
signing autographs on 2 occasions. And
exactly. So a lot of this is going to come down to, how this new commission actually is able to enforce those rules. And when they do, and they tell a student, no, you can't make that deal, can they stand up to the legal challenge that will come from that student athlete?
Well, and that's the thing. And this, the fact that they have this commission, okay, and that those commission decisions can be taken to an arbiter and arbitrated when an athlete thinks that he doesn't like the result. So the commission's going to give them their answer, and then the athlete's going to say, well, I still think I should be able to get this, and I'm going to take it to arbitration. And, an arbiter has a different set of rules that they're governed by in terms of arbitrating. I mean, by definition, arbitration is usually intended to be a compromise. So it's almost always going to shift the bar and the direction of the athlete, right, a little bit, so that you get in the middle of the yes no that is the commission's decision, and will lead to follow-up lawsuits probably as well. And it also simply is going to, that there hasn't had to be money paid to people under the table, the proverbial bagmen that have been a part of college football. And particularly in the Southeast United States and in Texas and other places like that, where the idea of having athletes get paid, with bags of money after a game and that sort of stuff by boosters, that all comes back, right? So you now you reinstitute that type of compensation. And everything goes back under the table. So players are still going to get paid, right? And if it comes down to it, and a highly sought after athlete is being pursued by multiple schools, and they're all giving him about the same amount of money in terms of the revenue part of the money, and then they're both offering him, NIL deals that are going to represent a certain amount of money that's, again, going to be somewhat competitive because that's what the commission's going to try to achieve. So what's the differentiator? Going back underground again. And, now we have to have an organization to enforce that, to investigate that and enforce that. And because we don't have collective bargaining and it's not a legal, situation, you don't have subpoena power, just like the NCAA didn't. I mean, the fundamental reason why the NCAA lost so many of its efforts to try to manage student athletes and the schools and keep them on the straight and narrow with the rules was because they could not use subpoena power. They did not have legal power and authority to require the truth to come out.
Right. One good sign for this new commission is that it was specifically mentioned that they are going to go with a faster investigative approach than the NCAA did. We all know how long these NCAA investigations could drag out. I saw the number quoted that they're aiming for no more than 45 days into these investigations. Yeah. So at the very least, they'll be faster. But to your point, they don't have any more teeth necessarily than the NCAA had.
Right. Which makes them inept. And what happens when an organization is inept? The NCAA is the example. Okay. And a couple of things about that. Okay. That 45-day thing, let me just give you the analogy. And by the way, let me take one step back before I say that. The NCAA is not going away. The NCAA is simply taking the two critical things that they threw over the wall and created this crazy firestorm of Wild West. Okay. And they now have turned that over to this commission through this House settlement. Okay. Because they did such a poor job of executing it. But they still have all the other rules, eligibility, all that other stuff. That's still going to be decided by the NCAA. Okay. Now, as an example, when somebody had an eligibility case, they believe that they should be made eligible. They submit reasons why they should be eligible. And then the NCAA decides whether that eligibility is going to be a yes or a no. And that process should have been able to be quite straightforward. It's basically, here are the facts of my circumstances. This is when I played. This is when I didn't play. This is why I think I deserve to have more eligibility. Very straightforward. Okay. By and large. All right. I mean, now there's each one of those cases had a specific set of circumstances and dates and stuff, but the fundamentals are the same. And yet they couldn't make those decisions. They were not even remotely timely about that. And players who were applying for that eligibility situation were often delayed from being able to practice with their team prior to their season, or even as far as not able to play the first few games until the school and the NCAA did their back and forth, asking questions back and forth, and times delaying, et cetera, because these guys don't work 24/7. They work, at best 5 days a week. It was a disaster, untimely, and decisions all being delayed to the last minute. It was horrible. All right. And that was just with the 1% of athletes who had eligibility issues. Now you're talking about a situation where pretty much every athlete who is what I would call historically scholarship capable or caliber of an athlete is going to be pursuing some forms of NIL money because it's available to them. If they're smart, they'll be doing that. And you're telling me that this organization, this commission, is going to now be able to process not 1%, but pretty much 95% of student athletes are all going to be throwing NIL information at them to say, we need you to decide whether this is legal or not. And they're going to do that in this timely 45-day window. What are the chances of that being true?
Right. Well, I'm not exactly sure. Apparently they do have some sort of electronic system set up to help them organize it, and I'm not exactly sure how big this commission is. I do think it to your point, the NCAA does still exist. I do think it is good that they have a new third-party organization leading this, because as Eve said before, the NCAA has so much baggage attached to it, so it's good to get a fresh start with this new system. But like you said, a lot's going to be figured out once the rubber hits the road. Like, what's the actual practical reality of how this works?
But here's my fundamental point. And now that I've painted that picture for you, Alex, and for our listeners, fundamental point is, how in the world did these people, and I'm specifically talking about presidents of universities, athletic directors of universities, and commissioners of conferences, mind you, all of which get paid hundreds of thousands and in many cases millions of dollars a year for their job, to do their jobs. How could that group have collectively sat around on their ass for the last 9 months waiting on this House commission? And actually, when they're hearing this, and we've heard about this commission now, for this commission concept, for months. You and I have talked about it before.
Right.
And you're telling me these guys all think this is going to work? I'm a guy on the outside looking in, just been a fan of the sport, been a fan of, of athletics, and understood what well-run conference, arrangements were, and ones that weren't well-run. And this has all the earmarkings of a disaster. Okay. It's an absurd idea. Okay. That they think they're going to be able to efficiently process all these very unique, and these are legal documents now. These are now legal relationships between an athlete and a potential NIL contributor who wants an exchange to happen, right? Sponsorship, promotion, whatever, all the different forms that can take. Very complicated, and they're supposed to then compare that and then and approve that, yeah, this is reasonable. This is a reasonable amount of compensation for this type of an event. It will only take a fairly short period of time, as NIL started off, when everybody thought this would be, the local coffee shop, sponsoring a player, for a particular coffee drink or something. And it quickly blew up into huge, massive pay-for-play situations. They don't think that's going to climb, and what is considered typical and average, or it's going to climb so fast. When you don't have collective bargaining and you don't have some way to limit that, I don't know how they're not going to just let those numbers climb. It'll take 3 years, and those numbers will be absurd, or less.
Yes. One other important detail I should mention is that it is built into this 10-year agreement that that $20.5 million will increase by 4% annually. And there are specific years, year 4, year 7, year 10, where new baselines would be established by the Power 5 athletic department revenues. However, it is possible, due to a new media rights contract or certain large events, that the plaintiffs' lawyers have two options during the 10-year settlement period to have new baselines set more quickly. So essentially, it's set to increase by 4% annually, but there are ways for it to increase by further amounts, based on the circumstances.
Well, so that thing, and that's the revenue side. That's the easiest thing to control. That's a very formulaic thing. That's easy, okay?
Right.
And the biggest challenge with the revenue share deal is
what sports?
What sports exactly? What sports get what, and what is defined as money for revenue share? Because here's one thing I've been hearing in some of the various debates since the announcement. It's not clear whether that money includes the scholarship or not. Okay, so right now, very random commentary, but let's say the University of Nebraska's scholarship cost for a student athlete, okay, how much money they spend to give somebody a scholarship, and that this is only the room and board and the tuition and fees and books and all that, and then other stipulated requirements on the academic side. Let's say that's $50,000 per student, right? And we have 250 athletes. And I know it's more than that. I think maybe it's more like 500 athletes. Let's say it's 500 athletes. So you got 500 athletes at $50,000 per athlete, right? What does that math add up to?
That's like $25 million.
Okay. So what are we really talking about here? Let's get some clarification on that. So if that's true, then how much money are they really getting in addition to what they already had? So that means that the 20.5 million must not include the scholarship money.
I think that must be the case. Yes.
Okay. But the point that the person was making was not clear, right? The level of detail that needs to be fleshed out of this thing before we're going to understand what's included and what's not and how they're going to manipulate that is really, really a challenge. And is going to lead to people who feel like, oh, that's not fair, or this isn't fair, or it's unfair to the girls versus the boys. The whole Title IX thing, also a whole nother bag of worms that has to be basically litigated. Somebody's going to not like the answer, and it's going to get to litigation, and then that litigation is going to take years potentially. I mean, think about this one. The reason the $2.2 billion going back X number of years is in part because of how much time it's taken for this lawsuit to start, become a class action, go through the court system, and get to this point.
Yeah, and on one of the articles I was reading, I believe it was on ESPN, this said one rough initial estimate within the industry is that 75% of the 20.5 million will get allocated to football players, 15% to men's basketball, 5% to women's basketball, and 5% to other sports. Now, that's just from, a random industry insider. But to your point, right, 15% to men's basketball, 5% to women's basketball, that's an immediate Title IX issue, right?
Yes. Well, and no, it isn't if you keep the revenue share concept based in the reality of who makes the money.
Right.
I mean, because if you take that off the table and somebody's able to get a court to agree that where the money is made in an athletic department that establishes this $20.5 million, where that money comes from is irrelevant. If they can prove that in court, then Title IX is fully in place, and it's going to be a 50-50 man-woman thing. And the football teams are going to be screaming bloody murder. Okay. So far they have been very clear that that's not their intention. Their intention is it's going to be acknowledged that, hey, it is men's football and men's basketball that produce, 80% of this revenue that we're talking about. Right.
Right. So basically to have a strong case in court, you could say, hey, to divide up this 20.5 million, we looked at, of our profits, of what sports are generating us money, what's the percentage allocated based on the teams? Okay, football is giving us 80% of our profit. They get 80% of this 20.5 million.
Right.
If women's basketball rises to a point where it is 5% profitable, they get 5% of the money or something like that.
And again, that is very debatable because profit's a very nebulous thing, right? Hardly anybody makes profit because they spend. They're a nonprofit entity. They spend pretty much everything that they bring in. If they weren't and they were stockpiling a bunch of money, people would be asking questions. Why are you stockpiling this money? Why aren't you doing something? Why aren't you giving it to the academic side? There would be all these other things going in there. So trust me, those athletic departments spend all that money.
Right.
And how they allocate it, there's a million different ways that you divide up, who pays for the dining room, right? Like at Nebraska, we got our new facility that just opened in the past year. And it is a, state of the art chefs and just incredible culinary facility. Now, how much of that is charged to the football team and how much of that is charged to every other athletic sports team that now gets to benefit from that massive investment.
Right.
Right. So So how all those allocations happen in behind the scenes obviously can affect, what's profitable and what's not.
Right. But to your point, regardless of how it's allocated, it's very clear that the non-revenue generating sports, which is the majority of sports,
Right.
at a college, the swim team, the volleyball team, the badminton team, the tennis team, whatever else, other smaller teams, you have wrestling, bowling, whatever it is. Those are the sports that are really going to suffer in this new arrangement.
I agree. And they are going to be asked to bear a burden, right? They're not profitable. So legitimately, if it's driven by how much did you produce or contribute to the bottom line for the institution, then they can't really demand anything, right? And yet, if you have a successful program, in the case of Nebraska, their volleyball program, I'm going to use two different scenarios that are not football. One would be Nebraska volleyball. It's by and large recognized as one of the few female athletic programs that is profitable. Okay, it's one of the few. But you could probably delve in there and figure out how their expenses are being allocated and stuff, and argue that. But because of the level of success and visibility that they produce for the university, it would be wise for the athletic department to make sure that they get a decent share of that money, that revenue share money, right, for those athletes. Now, another example would be our Nebraska women's bowling team, okay, which also has 5 or 6 national championships and has been a juggernaut in the sport of women's bowling since their inception, pretty much. Okay, what about them though? They don't have the visibility of the Nebraska volleyball team. They don't bring in and generate revenue and eyeballs and just positive energy and vibes like the women's volleyball team, who are rock stars.
Right.
So how much can you give to this team that has been really, really successful in bowling, but just doesn't generate the kind of enthusiasm and interest that the girls volleyball does? So all of those are going to be tough.
Right. And that is going to be tough. And I know there's already infighting on many college campuses between those sports, coaches and things like that over this $20.5 million pot. But say I'm, the bowling team. Okay, maybe you get 0 in terms of revenue. Like, sorry, you're not important enough. But you could still get on NIL, right? So we could still continue the arrangements we currently have, for your bowling team. We could still pay your players in these ways. And now that all has to go through this NIL Go, service and through this commission and get approved by them. So once again, that's really where a lot is going to be decided on, like, what things can still be done, or to your point, do we go back to like fully underground where it's the bagmen, to sustain what has been built in the past 5 years.
Right. And then you have, like you said, unique individual institutional decisions. Oregon being a great example because they have a legendary and extremely successful track program. Track is much like, football or, soccer or, other sports that, require a lot of athletes. And as such, it's a big number. So to support and give NIL money, give revenue share and NIL attention, okay, of your NIL dollars to track athletes at Oregon is going to draw away from other Olympic sports such as volleyball or swimming or whatever. And each school is going to have to make those individual decisions based on the history of their schools, the success in those programs, and coaches are going to leave and go to schools based on their school's athletic department's commitment to monies for their sport. And I feel like, if not a large part, certainly in a small part, one of the reasons why a very established and successful volleyball coach in the Big Ten at Oregon, Matt Ulmer, left Oregon to go to Kansas University in the Big 12, and it's a complete head scratcher to anybody looking at it objectively, from the outside. He went from a better situation to a worse situation in so many ways, except for potential NIL and
Right.
revenue share.
Yes, I remember you mentioned that when it happened at the time on the podcast. Now, the other big elephant in the room beyond Title IX, which we've already talked about, like you said, is collective bargaining, is unions. Because even though the athletes are now being officially paid by the university, they're still not employees. If you're not employees, you can't form a union. Whereas in other professional sports like the NFL, there is a players' union, right? And that union collectively bargains with the organization of the NFL, all 32 teams or whatever, and they come to an agreement, and there's a salary cap, and it's all kind of done universally. But college isn't set up that right? There's 134 teams just in the FBS, just in Division I, not even to mention Division II and the lower levels.
Right, exactly.
So, like you say, this will push, the people who have already been advocating for it will push harder now for some sort of labor union to be organized for the players, which solves certain problems, but creates a whole bunch of other new ones,
Absolutely. And that's the thing. And so that's why this House settlement really is just the end of the beginning.
I like that.
Of this very, very dramatic change that's going on in collegiate sports. And I think along the way, you're gonna start seeing more and more individual sports programs taking stock in what they can afford and what they can't, and how they should allocate their resources. And there's no one right answer, and it's going to be very dynamic, right? Because there's some schools that are going to decide to dive in and commit to certain things, and maybe let some others float and kind of see what happens, right?
Right.
And then you have circumstances like, what about the Big East, which is a powerhouse basketball conference, okay, that regularly has highly regarded teams in basketball, and has won its share of many national championships in men's basketball and women's basketball. And most of them don't have football teams, or if they do, they don't care about the football team. It's Division II, or it's a Division I that they don't really commit to. And so, while you talked about the generics analogy of 75% going to college football, and then 15% going to college basketball, and 5% going to the girls basketball, and then whatever's left going to all the other sports, right? Now, let's flip that around and say you're a UConn basketball, and you have great legendary success in basketball. Well, heck, instead of it being that 15%, whatever that amounts to, you could triple that and still be under the $20.5 million. You follow me?
Right.
So you could buy an enormous amount of basketball talent compared to anybody else. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and like you said, I forget the exact date, but there's a particular date in this agreement where it's like, by this date, you as a college have to commit to the fact that if you're going to commit to this 20.5 revenue sharing or not. So basically for the kind of smaller schools or lesser athletic departments, in the group of 5 of the FBS or FCS, things like that, basically you can choose, we're not going to take part in this at all. Because it's like, if you do, you have to abide by these rules. And if you don't have to. But then those universities that choose not to, obviously, they, especially for the major revenue generating sports like football and men's basketball, they will struggle even more than they already were, at getting talent, right? Like, no one's going to want to go there if I can get paid guaranteed way more at this other school.
You're exactly right. So that would be like $3 million. 15% of $20.5 million is $3 million. So you're saying that if, for example, that's a typical amount that's being allocated for men's basketball, I can tell you right now, there are men's basketball teams this year that had NIL arrangements that exceeded $10 million. Right. And so the revenue share in this scenario is only going to be $3 million of that. And that's probably about what a program that also has a football program would do. Now, that means that a UConn could throw $10 million of revenue share at their, and still be way under the 20.5, and then add another 10 million in NIL. So now they're dealing with $20 million where everyone else is operating at 10 million for a basketball team. You follow me? I mean, so there's going to be these inequities that are created by circumstances within individual athletic departments, and how that's going to be managed is another unanswered question.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Well, that was something we discussed on a previous podcast where I brought up the idea of, like, say for volleyball, right? Like, you invest way more in volleyball than the average college does. And so then you're able to offer, twice as much as your competitors, right? That's a way to attract talent. Even if that will mean some of your other sports suffer. But if you already don't have a very good football program, maybe you don't care,
Right. And so then does that mean that if you belong to a conference, let's say you belong to the Big Ten, and somebody in the Big Ten opted to do that, and they backed away from, compared to the other schools, let's say Northwestern decided, you know what, we're just not going to make that kind of investment into Northwestern football, but we're going to ride the wave of the Big Ten media contract, and allow that particular program to just kind of muddy in the mediocrity or worse. And in exchange for that, we're going to make all of our other programs exceptional. We're going to make our men's basketball team exceptional. We're going to throw a bunch of money at our some of our women's sports, and we're going to become, a collectively successful athletic department in everything but football.
As part of this whole thing, I decided to do a little bit of a history and legal dive, just to kind of understand, because, right now it's like the NCAA is settling all these lawsuits, for billions of dollars, because they know they would lose in court. And I'm just curious, like, how did it get to this point, right, where the NCAA has been around, for over 50 years. College football has been in the state of amateurism that it was for decades, and it was able to exist that way. And so I was just kind of curious, like, if it was on such shaky legal footing, how did that happen? And this was an interesting piece. I think it was from Georgetown Law, just going over, and this was specifically referring to the 2021 NCAA Supreme Court case that the NCAA lost, and it was basically analyzing why they lost. And this was basically discussing their amateurism rule, how the NCAA's amateurism rule didn't hold up to legal scrutiny. So for anyone out there who's wondering, why is the NCAA in this position? Here's one reason. It says, first, the rule provided an immunity or scope limitation of a kind the Supreme Court has long opposed. Second, it empowered the NCAA alone among antitrust defendants to choose values of its own liking and use them to excuse conduct that would be otherwise illegal. Third, as a corollary, it granted the NCAA a unique authority to preserve a product in a particular form, even one at odds with consumer preference expressed through free markets. Fourth, it allowed the NCAA to gain a special favorable antitrust treatment available to none of the thousands of other desirable and important economic integrations throughout the economy. And fifth, the rule gained no special status for the NCAA's assertion that it's a joint venture.
Yep.
From a legal perspective, that's part of what they were into, some of the problems they were facing.
And knowing that it was on that very weak legal ground, they avoided getting into a courtroom a lot, right? And they really were pretty successful at it, I believe, by and large, until college football money, television revenues became an issue in the original case that broke up the NCAA's control of college football television contracts. Because up until that time, and that happened in the 70s.
80s.
Well, the first one I thought was in the 70s, but I could have my timing wrong.
I'm sorry. The case was in 1984, but I believe the organization that was made by college universities to basically challenge the NCAA's, monopoly was made in like the late 70s, and then they challenged it in
Right.
court, and it took years and all that.
Right. But the bottom line is that was the first really high visibility, controversial thing that I can recall in my lifetime. There might have been plenty of challenges back in the, 60s and 70s that I'm not familiar with. But when that happened, that basically removed football from the control of the NCAA when it comes to televisions and revenues from TV contracts. And of course, that's where a massive amount of all this money that's flowed into the sport has come from, right?
Right.
It was ticket revenues in big stadiums and television revenues. And over time, then television revenues have continued to become a more significant part of it until they completely outstripped even ticket revenues. I mean, there was a time in my lifetime when it was way more important that you filled your stadium with, butts in the seats, so to speak, because of the money that stadium game day environment created was greater than the football TV generation. But now that's completely flipped.
Right. Yes, that was the 1984 case, NCAA versus Oklahoma Board of Regents.
Right.
Like you say, when I was looking at these, legal histories of college football, that's basically where they started. That was the real start of the turn.
Yep.
Though, here's an interesting one that I learned through this research. Do you know where the term student athlete originated from?
I do not.
Okay. So Walter Byers, the NCAA's first executive director, created the term in the 1950s to help the NCAA fight against workmen's compensation insurance claims for injured football players. And this is a quote from Byers now. Quote, "The student athlete was a term used to try to offset these tendencies for state agencies or other governmental departments to consider a grant and aid holder to be an employee." He said that in a court testimony in the 1990s. So basically, it was a way for you're not an athlete, you're not an employee of the university, and you're not fully a student because you're a special athlete and we're giving you this scholarship or whatever. And
Right.
so like there's a specific athlete who had died of a head injury in 1955
Okay.
and filed for workmen's compensation death benefits. And basically he was not allowed, his family was not allowed to receive those because of this like student athlete definition.
Gotcha. And they've been fearing the opening of the next Pandora's box ever since.
Right.
Right. Like, and I mean, they were so scared to go into court and have that kind of stuff exposed for the fraud that it was from a legal perspective. And they've just lost and lost and lost since then.
Right.
Based on all those things.
In that 1984 ruling that you mentioned, even though they lost, there was this little bit in the middle of it that's not because that ruling was about the TV contracts, right? And it basically said you can't have a monopoly over these TV contracts anymore, NCAA. But there was this other bit about player compensation that in a legal world would be called dicta, as in, it's in the opinion, so it needs to be considered, but it's not binding. It's not relevant to the main focus of the opinion, but it gave the NCAA something to stand on. And this is from Justice John Paul Stevens. It says, "Moreover, the NCAA seeks to market a particular brand of football, college football. The identification of this product with an academic tradition differentiates college football from and makes it more popular than professional sports to which it might otherwise be comparable to, for example, minor league baseball. In order to preserve the character and quality of the product, athletes must not be paid, must be required to attend class, and the like." So once again, even though that was not, relevant to the opinion, it wasn't binding stuff, but it was legal, phrasings from the Supreme Court that the NCAA was then able to point to their definition of amateurism throughout the years to come.
Yep, that's the deal. I mean, those are the kinds of things that they were hanging their hat on. And see, in my opinion, when it became apparent to them that the legal standing and the pressure to share money with athletes, which frankly has been debated for many, many years, going back again to the 70s.
Right. Well, yeah, because also in this in these discussions, I was saying there was a case in the 90s. I forget the team it was against, but basically they had, violated, I think it was about like fake classes. It was a massive scandal about fake classes, and the NCAA punished them, and then they fought back in court, and basically the court overturned the NCAA's decision and said they didn't have the authority to like do this, or were exerting too much over this institution. And it showed that the NCAA's enforcement going forward declined. It like halved in terms of the amount of enforcement actions they took against universities because they were scared of losing in court again.
Correct. Once that the institution, NCAA and its committees, there was enough data out there for them to recognize, okay, we've lost this battle in terms of these players being amateur and not employees. At that point, they should have conceded and started building a formula or an organized way that they could transition to the employment model with the collective bargaining agreement. And we would have been well past this. And the NIL component that's now gotten into this and created this pathway of literally almost unlimited funds that individual schools can pursue to directly compensate, pay for play players would never have been opened if they had just raised their hand. I mean, in hindsight now, I guarantee you, if you had been able to tell all these people that were making that decision back 4 or 5 years ago, when they finally made the decision they were going to throw this NIL and portal, eligibility thing over the fence and just make it the Wild West. If before that they would have been able to say, listen, this is what you're going to have in 5 years or 7 years, or you can simply start paying football players now, make them those student athletes employees. We're going to pay them this amount of money. We're going to give them, fringe benefits as well, health care, all that sort of stuff. And it would have been literally way, way cheaper than what the model that we now have and will have in perpetuity going forward, because you can't put this ketchup back in the bottle.
Yes. Well, and I'll just point out two last things about the NCAA's mishandling of this whole situation, which is very obvious for anyone who does the research. One is just that their whole, they clung to this amateurism definition, right, for these student athletes, but amateurism was a fluid definition based on what they said, because there were inconsistencies. Like if you were an Olympic athlete, right, you could be both a college student athlete, not allowed to make money, but then you can make money through NIL sponsorships as Olympian. Or this particular case, Kyle Parker got $1.4 million in a baseball signing bonus while serving as Clemson's quarterback in 2010. Or a tennis player received $10,000 per year in prize money, while also, being in college.
Right. Because the football was a different sport than the baseball, right? So they were able to separate those two realities, I guess.
Right. And in baseball, obviously operates on different rules, or basketball, right, where you can, go to the NBA much sooner versus like in football and things like that. So, just they were always full of inconsistencies that, people pointed out over the years. But then it was compounded in 2019. That was when Alston versus NCAA was a case that was brought, and the judge ruled against them. This one was focused on additional education-related expenses. So not even like, millions of dollars of NIL, just additional money for education stuff. And in 2020, the Division I Council enacted legislation allowing schools to offer annual academic awards up to $6,000 per student. But the NCAA looked at that state of affairs and that they had lost and said, no, we're going to appeal this to the Supreme Court, which then led to the Supreme Court decision in 2021 that was a 9-0 against them, with Justice Kavanaugh putting a strict warning about how, the NCAA was basically, on the verge of violating all these antitrust, laws and all this sort of stuff. And that's what really kind of opened the floodgates for some of the the lawsuits we're seeing now, when everyone saw, oh, this is how weak their position is.
Right, exactly.
So they didn't have to challenge that, right? They could have just accepted paying the $6,000.
Absolutely. And here's the irony. they ended up doing it anyway.
Right.
You know what I mean? It wasn't a few years later they all agreed to pay them $5,249 a year or whatever, and they gave it a different name, and it kept them from being employees or whatever. But again, they could have established some pay scales and that were going to increase at some reasonable rate and all that, and never brought up this NIL thing and brought attention to it. They could have handled the transfer stuff separately. I mean, this all could have been done so much better. And this gets me back to one of my fundamental points. The people that we should be angry at as college sports fans is the arrogant presidents and athletic directors and commissioners who were all in the room where it happened, to use a phrase from Alexander Hamilton. They all had the opportunity to use their brains and recognize what I think was obvious to even the average sports fan. Really was. I mean, I have been making this argument. Many people who I know have agreed and made this same argument for years and years and years and years, that we should have been paying these people, these players, a modest amount of money and set up a structure, recognizing that the quarterback is probably worth more to the team than, an offensive guard. And you could have set something up that would have given money to pretty much everybody on the team, and they would have shut up. The big complaint that athletes who were getting, basically screwed because they weren't getting any money, were having to use their laundry money to buy food. All these somewhat bogus stories about how they were, because they couldn't work. The rule was, because you're an amateur athlete, you couldn't work, right? You couldn't have a job while you were in school. And so these kids were claiming that they literally had no money. Well, you give them enough money that they're wealthier than the average student, and they would have been fine, and they would have been content, and the whining from the media and everyone else would have died down enough that pursuit in the court of law would have backed away, because everybody would have looked at it and said, hey, it's way better than it used to be, and that would have been good enough. But then they opened up this NIL box, and now they can't close it.
Right. Yeah. To your earlier point, back in the day, in the 70s, 80s, the money in the sport was just so much less, that there was less to complain about. There was less to fight over. But as the TV contracts started coming in and coaches starting getting paid, multi-million-dollar contracts while the players are getting paid nothing, that pressure ramped up over time. And instead of the NCAA and the people involved, like you say, conceding and compromising at that time, kind of seeing where the winds were blowing, they kind of were stubborn and stuck to the old line. And eventually, that burst, but it burst in a much more catastrophic way now versus if they had released some of that pressure earlier on by, like you say, coming up with a better solution.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, for all the money that those guys get paid and all the arrogance and intellectual power that they supposedly are supposed to have, they failed miserably. And I think we can't ever have this discussion without making that front and center, that these people were really, really lacked vision and foresight, and just flat out were unaware of the obvious in the room. Okay, the elephant in the room. They weren't willing to acknowledge it because of their own arrogance and because of their own greed to cling to all the money like it used to be. They didn't want to be the ones who conceded that the whole amateurism thing was gone.
Right.
Does that make sense?
No, yeah, it makes total sense. All right. Well, hopefully that was a good comprehensive look both at the history of this whole debate as well as the particulars of this House settlement. Obviously, as we mentioned, this is a massive sea change in the world of college football, and it's not even fully implemented yet. It officially goes into effect on July 1st. So in our future podcasts, obviously, we will comment on how things evolve, with this College Sports Commission, and see, like we said, when the rubber hits the road, what actually is going on. I would not be surprised if while we're doing our weekly podcasts, during the football season, talking about Nebraska. There's a side tangent about the latest lawsuit, that's come in about this new situation. So we'll have to see how this all plays out.
Yeah, exactly. And like I say, I think the number of lawsuits is going to be explosive in number. I mean, because they're going to want to challenge that stuff right away and have anything that would appear to limit the ability to compensate players. And you now have state laws in place that are going to have to be adjudicated because there are states that put in laws to protect their student athletes from being limited in the amount of money that they can be able to obtain, through NIL and stuff like that. So there will be challenges between these state laws and this new commission's decisions. It's going to be a mess.
Right. Though I did want to ask you this. So I know that, and this is unrealistic, I'm aware, but let's just presume for a moment that the commission survives these lawsuits and they're actually allowed to regulate, NIL, based on whatever their criteria is. And it all goes through them and they're able to solve the Title IX issues and all that sort of stuff. Do you think the system could operate and could be a success?
I would say it can operate, but I think it will consume itself. I think it is unsustainable over the long term. And the only way that it will come to a point of equilibrium is that a number of schools and maybe entire conferences are simply going to bail on it completely and say, we're not participating anymore. We're going to still pursue student athletes and we're going to still have a sports program, but we're not going to do this. We're just not going to participate. And knowing that means they're not going to get the high-end athletes who can command that money, right? But then over time, as the number of seats at the table, so to speak, diminishes, then some of those athletes are going to lose their opportunities. Either the schools aren't going to have the sports programs anymore, so those are just athletes that will no longer be student athletes, or they're going to be student athletes, but they're going to be at a school that has made the conscious decision to not participate, and they're gonna find other schools that all equally have agreed that we can't afford this. So if you want to be a student athlete in the traditional sense, come to a school. We'll give you a scholarship. We're gonna even give you a little stipend and stuff like that. But we're not doing this other stuff. And if you're not in for that, that's fine. And then we're gonna call ourselves a new level. The National Smart People's Athletic Association, and we're going to play a good brand of competitive sports where the rules are equitable and each team has a fair shot at success, and people are going to enjoy that, and then we'll pursue a revenue stream from television or whatever, and we'll rebuild this thing from scratch under a whole different scenario and let that one run independent of us. And over time, see what happens. See where fans' attention goes, right? Because I'm here to tell you that if Nebraska made that choice, I would follow Nebraska to that new scenario.
Right.
Knowing that Ohio State and Michigan and all the big boys are still going to be doing their thing, I would be happy to follow Nebraska if it stayed at a lower level.
Right.
Because that's where my fandom starts.
Right. Well, because unlike pro sports, right, college sports has always been about your loyalty to the institution, not to individual players, because they're gone after 4 or 5 years. But if this unionization thing actually did happen and students were employees, then that also brings up conversations about can you kick people out, after 5 years, right? Are there eligibility limits, or can you stay an employee, and keep playing college football as long as you, don't screw up or don't, fall below the standards or whatever, which is a whole other can of worms.
Yes, it is. And I don't know the answer to that legally,
right?
But I think that's easier to solve, frankly, than some of the other things that they've let happen.
Alrighty. Well, we hope you out there enjoyed listening to this particular episode. As we mentioned, our next episode will be episode 200, and we're planning to do a special in-person podcast for that one, so you fans can look forward to that. You can email us at huskerpete13@gmail.com. You can also find us if you search for College Football Throwdown on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can leave us a rating or review there. We always love hearing feedback from the fans. So thank you out there for listening, and thank you, Dad, for joining me for this episode. Until next time, go Big Red.
Go Big Red.